Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of In Conversation. I'm your host, James Campbell, and today I'm very happy to be joined by Maggie MacDonald, a contributor to Intellect's Handbook of Adult Film and Media. Maggie, welcome. It's wonderful to have you on the show. How's it going?
Hi, James. I'm happy to talk about the chapter.
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you again for your time. It's wonderful to meet you, and I'm really glad that you've been able to join us today. For anyone who isn't familiar, we are basically going to be talking about every chapter in this handbook over the next year. And Maggie's one of the first people I've got on the show, so it's wonderful to have you. And we're really kicking things off with a bang. So can I just start, though, by asking you just to tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're based, do you teach, and what are your research interests?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a pornography platform scholar, which is an interesting bridge between two relatively young fields of study, of inquiry, based at the University of Toronto at the Faculty of Information. And I am particularly interested in the more technical side of pornography platforms. I like to look at the infrastructural elements of these sites. I like to look at the governance, especially of how that is reshaping standards across the entire industry. And I'm ultimately a political economist. I'm interested in how labor and values are baked into these technologies. So I use a variety of different approaches in my work because I am still an early career scholar as a graduate student. So a lot of digital methods, some discourse analysis, and a lot of policy analysis. I'm quite interested in the way that these spaces are regulated as part of their governance, like how states and how governments are responding to these in a very unusual way that we'll unpack later. And in addition to that, I'm wrapping up my dissertation right now. I'm writing a dissertation on platform governance through the case of Pornhub. Without a doubt, Pornhub is my primary site of study. I do most of my scholarship has been focused on elements of that company. And I should also note that I'm also an advisor to a board advisor on the independent advisory board to ECP Canada, which is the company that they own the company ALO that manages Pornhub. It's a bit of a technical nesting doll situation there, but it means that I do also do advisory work with the platform directly.
Okay. Thank you very much. So so you're coming at this from both like a kind of like a practical industry position as well as a scholarly academic one, which I think is perfect. Well, I guess I should also say huge congratulations, because this is a really important and an exceptional chapter, I must say, in what we're hoping is going to become one of the definitive volumes on the topic. So well done. That's just amazing to get such a key chapter early in your career. And I think that's something that we should highlight, because a lot of people, I think, who are in your position, they don't take the leap, and they don't submit, and maybe they wait till they've got their PhD, it's all finalized, and then it's another year and another year, and the next thing you know, they're 5 years into their career before they've even considered publishing something. So I think what you've done is really valuable as well, and a great example for other people who are starting off their path as an early career researcher.
That's an extremely generous framing. I just have the audacity.
Well, if a few more people did, then perhaps they would be able to, get ahead of things too. But tell us a little bit about how you encountered the Handbook of Adult Film and Media, and how you kind of ended up submitting a chapter.
Yeah, well, something you might end up hearing from several of the authors in this collection is that the world of pornography studies is a relatively small one. We all tend to be in some form of contact with one another. We tend to be familiar with one another's work. So there's probably going to be a good amount of personal connection throughout your conversations with the authors. In my case, it was a very direct path, because one of the 3 editors of this collection, Dr. Patrick Keelty, is my PhD advisor at the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto. So Patrick approached me and asked if I would be interested in submitting the pornography platforms chapter, and I was happy to do so. I think it's a great opportunity.
And we'll be interviewing Patrick on the podcast tomorrow, in fact. So I'm not quite sure whether this episode or his will come out first, but it's going to be a glut of the community all speaking about different topics. So thank you very much again for being here, and also for just explaining a little bit more about your own background. So could you just tell us a bit more about your chapter, though? What's the kind of like, what's the rationale behind it? Is there a particular kind of thesis or a method? Is there anything you would highlight? If someone just wants to know, like, why would I read this chapter? Can you just give them a bit of an overview of what it's all about?
Absolutely. So from a disciplinary standpoint, I really do straddle the worlds of pornography studies and platform studies. It's interesting as a researcher, because if I ever introduce myself to someone from outside of those fields, or even just from platform studies, I feel like the pornography looms very large in the imagination. So that they often tend to think pornography first, but in a lot of ways, the frameworks that I use and the approaches that I take up are much more traditional platform studies approaches. Much of porn studies comes from traditions of like textual analysis and cinema studies, and I have not really any background in that. I'm more focused on the kind of infrastructural and labor side of things. So with this chapter, what I wanted to do was introduce people who may not be familiar with the key tenets of what makes a platform, what is platformization. I wanted to use two of the biggest platforms out there today, the adult platforms, OnlyFans, the subscription site, and Pornhub, the free streaming site, to walk through a series of how platforms arose out of the economic circumstances that created them, what kind of effects they had early on in the advent of platforms, and then what qualifiers are there? What do all platforms have in common, and in what ways? I think a lot of discourse around pornography platforms really exceptionalizes them. It's quite panicky, obviously, in the public eye, but in so many ways, these platforms function just like every other platform. There's a bunch of commonalities they share, and I wanted to use this chapter as an opportunity to showcase how that looks.
Is this a particularly interesting moment for platform studies, especially when you combine it with pornography? Because I guess there are quite a lot of legal frameworks and things that are under review, changing. But is it just in general, is this kind of a real important moment for platform studies?
Yeah, I think politically it's a really interesting moment to be looking at what's happening on pornography platforms, because we're seeing over the last couple of years, and very much in this moment, a global wave of age gating policies that are sort of sweeping first platforms. First, they always come for the pornographers. And so we see the adult platforms having these policies of enclosure set around them that are ostensibly to protect children. And those are that's a very contested premise in the first place. It creates a whole lot of issues with surveillance and censorship. But I think when it comes to the larger world of platforms, it's important for everyone to be paying attention to what's happening to pornography platforms now, because you're going to be seeing that rippling out in big ways to be a precedent for many other forms of engagement online in the future. We're already seeing it with Discord recently rolling out their own age ID verification scheme. And I think that this is probably also something that you're going to hear from multiple authors. There's like a bit of an adage about how pornographers are the canary in the coal mine for larger cultural and political effects. And that is also true when it comes to this more technical element. So it's a timely time to be thinking about pornography platforms.
It kind of leads me on to my sort of my first proper question, if you will. And in your chapter, which is pornography platforms in the Intellect Handbook of Adult Film and Media, you suggest that porn platforms are actually not that exceptional, really, and that there's basically more. It's more like you just said. It's like you're more of a platform expert than you are a pornography expert, potentially. So, can you explain what you mean by that? These are just sort of regular platforms, that they're not particularly different.
Yeah, definitely. Because despite, I think, the hold that platforms have over all of our lives in the year 2026, I think many people don't take the time to dig down and really reflect on what is a platform. So this is also a fun exercise in recognizing that this is the case for all of these platforms, not just adult platforms. So things platforms have in common. First and foremost, a platform is not just a website. It is an infrastructure that facilitates interactions between different user groups and different parties. So, you have creators and audiences, and on social media, those are often the same. You have things like ride shares, where it's drivers and riders, or development platforms, where it'll be coders and users, buyers and sellers. Like it's a whole network of different people brought together on the site. Now, that means that the platform itself is not providing products necessarily. Sometimes they are as well as part of their business model, but first and foremost, they provide infrastructure to bring that network together, to bring that market into being, right? So they'll set up standards, technical standards, rules. They establish payment systems. They're responsible for discovery mechanisms. They have trust and safety standards, like a lot of logistics on the back end. But they're not necessarily focused on content or on the services provided or the products. They're focused on what brings them together into a market. And because of that, all platforms rely on a few basic principles. A huge one is network effects. Like the value of a platform really closely correlates to how many people are using the platform. If you were to, if a bunch of social media services all sprung up out of the ether at the same time, but only had a few users on each, none of them would be particularly attractive to you. We see as soon as one platform begins to gain a lead in its market, and you see this in a lot of fields when you think about social media, there's not really a comparable competitor to Meta, right? There's a real winner takes all effect in this network effect model, where as soon as users begin to flood towards one platform, it really culminates. There's a snowball effect. And so they develop a huge market lead, and they end up having a lot of gravitational power in that sector, right? So we see that with OnlyFans, with Pornhub. There are, of course, others, but you really do tend towards this oligopolistic business style. And platforms have a position of power. They really are, in some ways, they prefer to pretend to be neutral intermediaries. We're just bringing you together. We don't do anything while you go about your business. But, a huge piece of the pie of platform scholarship is platform governance, because all platforms are imposing things like terms of service. They have rules for what kind of conduct and what kind of content can appear. They set things like pricing structures and monetization models. And huge is they have the ability to set ranking and visibility systems, as well as like moderation protocols. So while sort of pretending to be these neutral stages upon which we live out our lives, platforms are governing all the participants in their systems in very often strict ways, but all are meant to suit their bottom line, to suit their business model and the platform's goals. Now, the way that they make money, platforms, I think this might be one of the most core things that if you have never thought about the difference between a website or a platform, this is something that really sets a platform apart. Rather than extracting value from traditional sales of a product or a service, they extract value by monetizing the power of our attention and our engagement. So platforms are interested in, they'll siphon off transaction fees. They make money through advertising. They do make money through subscriptions and sales sometimes, or for premium services like premium memberships, but mostly it's a data monetization thing that has shifted from former buyer-seller economic models, where platforms are aggregating en masse, thanks to these massive networks they've built up, the behavior of millions and millions of users. They are able to take millions and billions of data points. And by expropriating that data and anonymizing it, especially on porn platforms, they don't care what you individually are looking at. They care about crowd behaviors effectively, because this is very valuable information for data brokerages who are working for advertising optimization and who are trying to target the types of behaviors that certain demographics display. So that is a very valuable resource for a platform. They want the entire experience to seem frictionless. They put a lot of work into optimizing the interface, so when you move in it, it feels quite natural, right? But there are certain behaviors that are being funneled, traffic is being funneled in certain directions. And all along the way, every time you're clicking or commenting or scrolling through something, that behavior is being monitored. Now, a lot of this is only made possible because platforms also have this very modular, scalable business model. These aren't, brick and mortar businesses, obviously. They have the ability to, as trends change, as user groups start to demand different things of their platforms, or as new technologies are being developed all the time, they have the ability to scale up dramatically, to centralize operations and centralize data, to insist that all of their third parties conform to their preferred standard. And they also have the ability to automate a lot of processes. So it means that the scale of these companies can become massive. Their reach becomes larger than anything we've ever seen prior to platforms, while still keeping costs relatively low, keeping the limited number of employees, a limited number of resources. They really only need what is required, the hardware, to manage their software infrastructure. So that's a lot of information, but basically,
I just want to say thank you, because that I think is fascinating, like kind of platforms 101 almost. And I think, well, first thing, why am I in books? What am I doing here? Someone's going to do it right. No, but I think it's really fascinating, because I think a lot of people who will be listening to this, who maybe aren't familiar with your work on platformization, who are just interested in the topic, let's say, we're often applying AI, we're often applying new technologies in retrospect to things that we're interested in. So we're studying literature, but how is AI affecting that, or something like this? How is technology affecting that? And I think with platforms, it's been quite insidious and insipid, how it's kind of crept into all aspects of lives, and how you say has adapted and become more and more powerful. And as the data expands, so does their kind of power and market control on these different things. And I think a lot of people generally just don't really think about platforms in that way, and they do think, yeah, that's just like a website I use. And so thank you very much for just kind of taking us back to basics there, because I think a lot of people perhaps don't actually sort of, think about that in that way. So moving on though, one of the things which I guess is quite different perhaps is how pornography and adult entertainment platforms are kind of governed and regulated and compared to other platforms. Would you just maybe tell us a little bit about that, and how that regulation sort of differs, or how your research might have unearthed some things around that topic?
Absolutely, because I think one of the red threads of an argument that underlie a lot of my research is that in a technical and even in an economic sense, pornography platforms are largely indistinguishable from any other type of platform. They're interested in all of the same things, data expropriation, optimizing, expanding scale, etc. I think that the two things that really set pornography platforms apart are, one, the cultural baggage that is not unique to platforms, but is unique to pornography and has haunted pornography for centuries. The politicization of pornography, it becomes this cultural inflection point for so many larger anxieties about the way the world is changing, about who has power. And the way you see that play out on platforms is that the regulation of platforms is what really sets them apart. Now, these roots go quite deep when it comes to sexual content on the internet. Something that is an underlying rule for the way that a lot of platforms operate is called safe harbor as shorthand, but it refers to Section 230 of 1996's Communications Decency Act. And this is an American piece of legislation, but in the strange jurisdictional world of the internet, it has become sort of a de facto piece of legislation for a lot of major global platforms that either have servers or operations based out of the US and North America. It really is like a key governing law of the internet, Section 230. And what it means is that platforms are not treated as publishers of content. we're talking about pornography platforms. So if a user was to upload a pornography video to Pornhub, Pornhub is not the publisher of that video. Pornhub is an intermediary. The user is the publisher of that video. And this is a very, very important law underlying the internet because it's a precondition for free speech, right? Because if platforms were made responsible for the content their users upload, then platforms would be taking a much more proactive role in restricting what users are able to say for reasons of liability. And when they're absolved of liability, there's obviously a huge slew of issues with that are constantly being debated in in political spheres, but also just talking heads online, cultural thinkers. This is a big problem that no one has really found a good balance of a solution to yet. But Section 230 allows political dissidents to be able to exist in online spaces. You know, it was a huge part of the Arab Spring.
Yeah.
But it is also the reason that you are always seeing white supremacists on YouTube. So Section 230 has good and bad elements. The reason I'm talking about it so much is that since 1996, which that is stone tablets in internet years. Platforms were not even a twinkle in the World Wide Web's eye at that point. But this law is still a very dominant law in how platforms operate. It has only been modified once substantially, and that was in 2018 with FOSTA SESTA. And this is a piece of legislation that was intended to fight effectively child endangerment and human trafficking. That was how it was positioned. But FOSTA SESTA meant that platforms became liable in exactly one kind of narrow case, which is in instances that could be considered to have been aiding or abetting in or facilitating like sex trafficking, child sex trafficking, a whole kind of slew of child endangerment and sexual abuse. Now, the problem with that is that the ability to differentiate what that looks like is something that most platforms are not interested in the nuance of, right? So as soon as SESTA FOSTA came into being, Backpage, a very popular service used amongst sex workers for safety reasons as well, communicating with one another, shut down. Craigslist Personals stopped allowing people to post personal ads. Like, it created a huge slew of platforms suddenly being concerned about their responsibility and their proximity to any type of sexual content, because there's a lot of interpretability in something like FOSTA SESTA. And when a platform is more concerned about an economy of scale than about these like subtle cultural nuances, it's ultimately easier to just over moderate that sector. So it's the reason why you can watch like an 8-part COVID conspiracy series on YouTube, but you can't say the word porn on TikTok.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of bananas, isn't it? So
yeah,
you've used the term, I think, moral panic probably around sex in general in society, and you've alluded to that already. So it seems like these moral panics are shaping laws, policies, and public debates. And also, I mean, let's be frank, it seems like there's a really good way for people to say point and look over there at those platforms when we should really be looking at an island. You know what I mean? So it's kind of it feels like it's highly politicized, and just like a layer of moral panic that doesn't necessarily exist in reality, that gets amplified and exaggerated and I guess labored and politicized in different ways. How's your research kind of focused on that, like moral panics and these kinds of things?
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge part of what drives the governance of pornography platforms, because while the platform operators would prefer to just business as usual, like any other platform, they have their priorities. Not only are they subject to this kind of regulation, we touched on age gating laws, on things like FOSTA SESTA. We also, they have to respond to that type of regulation in their operations. They have to anticipate it. They have to adapt. They're, there's a rich tradition of work in porn scholarship that shows how much pornographers are early adopters of new media techniques and new media technology because of this, because it's a sector that constantly has to adapt. and constantly has to be thinking ahead of regulators and thinking ahead of censors, because there is this moral panic that's deeply embedded in the way that these companies are handled, right? In my own work, specifically the dissertation that I am immersed in right now, it actually all focuses around one event that is very driven by moral panic. I'm doing a series of studies around Pornhub's 2020 child sexual abuse material moderation scandal, which was kicked off on December 4th, 2020, with an op-ed in the New York Times by Nick Kristof called "The Children of Pornhub." That was effectively, it was a very inflammatorily, phrased article that accused Pornhub of profiting from the circulation of child sexual abuse material and like so-called revenge pornography and other abusive content, that they're like flagrantly and willingly maintaining its circulation in order to profit and hurting people. And I think it's very important to say that there was abusive material on Pornhub, absolutely. It's not to say, not to minimize any of the harms that these people have experienced, but the article whipped this like public frenzy around Pornhub that within a week of the article's publication, Visa and MasterCard had dropped them as clients. They dropped the entire MindGeek network. The Canadian government called within a few months the company into a parliamentary ethics committee hearing, and Pornhub itself in also within a week had changed massive amounts of things about the way that the platform operates, including dropping a huge quantity of material from their site. Like, we do not see large platforms behave like this very often, but this was a response to this public outcry and this moral panic. But the thing that's interesting about this is that they were responding to all of this, and the article's original framing really made it sound like, child sexual abuse material and like abusive content is a porn problem, but it's already illegal to host that material all across like North America. And when service providers, like when a platform or an internet service provider or even a user encounters it, these companies are required to report it to an organization called NECMEC. That's the central reporting body of CSAM clearinghouse. Now, the year that this article came out, NECMEC received, this is horrifying, but like 33 million reports of child sexual abuse material online. Very terrible. And 29 million of those were from Meta properties. This is not a pornography problem. I
mean, I think that's a really important point to make there, because the moral panics have always existed around pornography, and been to a few porn studies conferences over the years. And fascinating, one Swedish scholar once was delivering a paper on moral panics around boxes of materials that would be left at secret coordinates in the forests in Scandinavia.
That was Susanna Passanen, wasn't it?
There you go, yeah.
Absolutely.
It was wonderful. Like you said, it was a small world. It was a wonderful paper, and it was eye-opening for me. But there was obviously quite a bit around like I've seen deliver two papers on this. One was about moral panics, effectively, and how this was, and everyone was like, "This is just going on." And then the other one was just about kind of distribution, circulation, and like things have changed, but similar drivers. But I digress. The thing which is, obviously stands out to me there is it's also like the irony of like the New York Times or whoever, it could have been anyone. Of course, their revenue is now very tied to advertising and to clicks and to what's generating a lot of clicks. And moral panic tends to generate a lot of clicks, which leads me to something that someone had said to me the other day when we were talking about sort of the internet in general, or another one of these conversations. And it was quite fascinating in this context because, historically speaking, sex has always been a driver, pornography has always been a driver, and sexualized content, you get people to click and they'd want to look at this because of that. But what drives technology more and what affects these platforms more, according to this person, which I'm sure you'll be able to speak to us about, is often not in the case with Pornhub, but in the case with, say, Meta, is rage. And things that get clicks now is less sexualized and more rage baiting and like political. So it's almost like you're in a, you know, they're utilizing pornography to say there's an issue over here, when in fact you're using the pornography just to get people riled up to click here to get the advert, you know what I mean? And it seems like the New York Times or whoever else might have been involved in publishing any of these kinds of articles is all caught up in that same kind of rage bait chamber, which is actually more of a driver for the economics of platforms across the board than perhaps sex, which used to be one of the main things. And I think what they thought the internet and what they thought, you know, social media was going to all be driven by sex in a sense. And in fact, a lot of it's rage, which says a lot about the power of technology over us. And also, I think, yeah, anyway, I digress. But do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Jody Dean calls this communicative capitalism. And it's the idea that what we are saying has become secondary to the fact that something is being said and how much attention accumulates around it en masse. Right. And so the quality of what is said, the particular qualities of any utterance of speech, of any tweet, of any post, of any video, are almost unimportant. What is more important is how much engagement happens around it. And so what gets engagement? Polemic statements. It's not necessarily that it always has to make people angry. It can make you baffled. It can make you feel like you have to have a rejoinder to it. It can make you feel titillated. Like it can be something that's a little attention grabbing in many different ways. But polemic content is what is driving the bulk of attention, because in the way that platforms monetize your attention, you don't need to offer them sustained attention. All they need is that momentary attention. They need that click, they need that data point, and as soon as you've done that, it's like relatively easy to move on, right? Because when you're operating at scale, it's not about the length or the quality, I'll say. And so you definitely see that in this inter-platform ecosystem. I think you nailed that, where inflammatory stories about pornography and what it is doing are very popular because it has become like a bit of a lightning rod for moral panic. There are all sorts of horrible things going on in the world. Human trafficking is a huge problem that mostly lives in the agricultural sector. But the complicated, you know, geopolitical issues behind that, things like people being taken advantage of in migratory schemes, you know, the fact that 80% of child sexual abuse happens through a perpetrator who is an immediate known person to the victim rather than a stranger in an unmarked white van. Yeah. Well, it's really difficult for us to envision that the horrible things happening in the world are permeating into our neighborhoods and our ordinary, you know, Facebook news feeds. It's much easier to conjure this other. And you know, the dark web, pornography as an industry, that makes for a very convenient other. And it's such a shame because it actually, I think in so many ways, big picture makes it difficult for people doing really good work in these areas to do their work effectively. It siphons attention away from them. It siphons resources away from them. And it keeps us from real solutions, and it drives pornographers crazy.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you actually, was like, what are the practical implications of these tighter regulations and these witch hunts in the sense, you know, obviously it pushes probably certain content underground. And then also how does this maybe affect content, and how does it affect performers and people who are already potentially at risk within the industry? Is this having any positive effects, or is it kind of more, how is this negatively also affecting people who are, you know, working within the industry, especially performers and people who, you know, aren't in an ivory tower somewhere over here counting checks and clicks? Right.
So I guess there's two things here. The first I'll say is like moral panic is affecting the type of sexual imagery that we can circulate or we can monetize online in very particular ways. Like for people who are you know, cam performers or streaming performers or subscription sites, there is a whole slew of things that they are explicitly unable to do. Things like blood play. There's certain types of sex acts that involve like bodily fluids. I don't want to get too into it for your readers here, but
well, I just will say, to be honest with you, just to interject for a second, is we get loads of bodily fluids through our performance art work. So, again, another
okay. No
another
one's
kind of, and a lot
intellect.
of blood work as well. We've done a lot of work with
Yeah.
people on athe. So a lot of, it does show a little bit of the irony again that you have. Some of these performance artists have died for their practice. Some of them have certainly been taken to the emergency room many times because of bloodletting and various different things. But again, that's given a different veneer. It's certainly it's a high art form rather than
Right.
this dirty step cousin or whatever down here. So it's
Right.
interesting, again, just as an example, is that our readers should be quite familiar with bodily fluids, bioart, eco-materialism, different topics in the visual and performance art space that would, if you label it differently, potentially be considered pornographic or potentially just disturbing in whatever way, shape, or form. But it's not, it's high art, so it's interesting. So, but again, I pardon me for interrupting you.
No. Well, so there's this interesting line between what is permissible in pornography and what's objectionable in pornography. And the pornographers don't get to draw that line for themselves. It's not about what they're comfortable with or their consent. It's often about the payment processors that are involved in this chain of monetization. Because there are a whole series of rules around what is allowable, what payment gateways and providers will be willing to let porn sites platform if they're working with them. And it means that creators are unable to, blood play is an obvious one, but also pornography is very much about the boundaries of the permissible and being transgressive. And there is a lot of sexual fantasy out there about things like CNC, which is consensual non-consent, the idea of being dominated or of having your power taken away. And there's a lot of play like that, or that has to do with like states of consciousness, being inebriated, that is just not allowed on these major platforms anymore. And I think that's very interesting, that that's not something that we're determining like in our highest courts, but that's something that Visa and MasterCard have decided. But so there is like a certain moral panic around that. I think it's fascinating that you can't have consenting adults making money off of a consensual non-consent scene for people who want to see it. But again, you can have white nationalists claiming that vaccines cause transgenderism, and that's fine. We can monetize that. Because I think some of these things are positioned as being risky and harmful, but I would argue that in many ways they're not risky and harmful. I think that there's a whole lot of very material harm that comes from other types of content that is not pornographic in nature, that we are not monitoring closely enough for its risk and harm. So the one side is moral panic plays a huge role in that. The economies of scale also play a huge role in that too, because this is why you see, I think you very briefly touched on this, this is why you see certain tropes in porn. This is why you see certain things repeated over and over again. I hang my hat as a researcher in the Pornhub corner. I'm very interested in the effects of these like major streaming sites, but Pornhub is like all of the big media streaming platforms are. It's going to be amplifying certain effects, and those effects are not necessarily like good nor bad, but they are very clear to anyone who has spent any time on Pornhub. They are things like step siblings who are in a whole bunch of improbable scenarios, these like 1 degree of difference away from incestuous family configurations, because it's very transgressive. You see a lot of, I want to say, you see a lot of very boundary pushing and often inappropriate like language to describe trans people and people of color. You see language that could, obviously be very derogatory towards women, towards ethnic minorities. And that's not because there's some deep desire in the population to like see step sibling porn. That's an amplification effect. That's a media amplification effect, because as we pointed to, the way that these monetization systems work, it just takes one click. So an attention-grabbing headline, an attention-grabbing title, like a thumbnail, is all it takes. And then the other content creators, they don't live in vacuums. Just like as a viewer, you're seeing certain patterns emerge, the creators are seeing certain patterns emerge, and they are there not for the love of the game. They are there to make money. Like, it's a job. And so they're going to start modeling their content on what they see being already successful content. And that really intensifies the amplification loop. So we see certain things repeated over and over again. And as someone who's like, let me tell you, I've spent a lot of time on Pornhub.
Yeah.
Quite often you click these links that will say, you know, step cousin stuck in a washing machine. And it's not actually doing anything truly transgressive with the actual
sexual content.
That's really just a way to have the metadata and the titling and the like frame of what is otherwise like often two bland white people having sex in an empty California condo. Like it's not really boundary pushing at all.
Well, you kind of answered my next question, but I want to go a little deeper because I wanted to ask, you know, how is the algorithms and things of that nature that impact platformization? How are they affecting content creation, and how are they affecting the lack thereof of creativity, or are they creating more? So it sounds to me like, you know, a lot of things that you know, if you're a casual user and you go on there, you think, oh my God, everyone's just watching step sibling porn these days or something. But in fact, that's the algorithm is almost being manipulated just to find something that's easy to recreate, and it's kind of like a facade. Is that how so? Yeah, so I guess a couple of questions there around how do the algorithms affect creativity on Pornhub, let's say, specifically, because something you know a lot about, and how much are those algorithms sort of dictating actually what's being said, but not really based on what people are genuinely interacting with. It's kind of like, again, it's sort of like you're flashing something that voyeurism is going to grab someone's eye for longer, or they're going to click on this, and then all of a sudden you get a million reproductions of that. I guess there's a question in there somewhere.
No, I heard I got some questions in there. So I think the first question is like, how is this impacting the industry in terms of what's it doing to creativity? How is this algorithmic recommendation model changing what porn looks like and how porn gets made? And in platform studies, this has been very well theorized by my other PhD advisor, Dr. David Nieborg. Shout out to David. It is, along with his colleague, Dr. Pohl, they wrote a paper on how platforms have created something that they call the contingent cultural commodity, which is that in all culture industries, be it, you know, how Spotify is changing music, how Netflix is changing serialized television, how Pornhub is changing porn, how part of the side effects of these massive economies of scale and these massive market dominant leads that the major platforms take over culture industries is that they both control what is going on in their ecosystems through the affordances and the constraints of their technical systems. But because they are so huge, and because the audiences in these sites are so huge, it isn't only influencing what happens in their systems. It ripples out to impact the way that people move throughout the larger culture industries, because they begin to anticipate that their media is going to look a certain type of way. We begin to, like, media are training machines, they're learning machines. We begin to look for certain forms over and over again. So, you know, we see this on Pornhub through the repetition of certain lengths of video, the repetition of certain tropes, not just the extreme ones like the step sibling things and the race play, but you see things like videos tend to be 7 to 15 minutes in length. They tend to be a sort of a series of vignettes that are kind of decontextualized, where there's a series of acts happening. They tend to be shot in a very particular sort of angular way. That we go through trends, obviously. Like, there used to be that real, like, hardcore shaky cam trend. Now it's a little bit more professionalized. It really rewards the videos that stylistically stick to that format, right? So on a baseline level, I could make a 2.5 hour long silent black and white
like a long form,
and I can upload it to Pornhub. Yeah, absolutely. They let you do that.
Like the old days.
It won't be rewarded. Yeah, like, it won't be rewarded in the same way. It won't be amplified. It won't be pushed to the front page. It won't necessarily tap in to that slipstream of the algorithmic recommender system that is the gold mine if you're a content creator who's trying to make money in these systems. So it basically makes the act of cultural production become contingent to what the platform chooses to reward. Because you are constantly optimizing. The individuals as well as the system are constantly optimizing for the system. And we see that in very particular ways in porn. It looks like a very certain way right now that I think most people, as soon as you say pornography, they can conjure that up. The other thing is that pornography, as we've spoken about, being governed in such a different way, being regulated so through moral panic, and being very subject to the volatility of payment processors, porn platforms are very volatile. Platforms fail all the time. Not necessarily the big two that I have been writing about in this chapter, but smaller platforms fail constantly. They have their, payment processors pull out, they get demonetized routinely. But for porn creators, they also have to rely on building up their audiences and creating reliable income streams by working on multiple platforms all at once. It is very, very unusual to see like a professional pornography creator have a presence narrowed to one platform, because they really are operating within an inter-platform ecosystem where they'll be using mainstream social media like X, like Reddit, like TikTok, to Instagram is very popular, to drive audiences towards their subscription sites or their canon sites in order to make income. Because OnlyFans, for those listeners who are familiar, you don't open up OnlyFans to a main feed and scroll through a bunch of options. You really have to go to the landing page of the particular creator that you're subscribing to. And so they do that using services like Pornhub, where they can post their streaming content for free, little clips, little teasers, driving traffic towards their subscription sites, as well as making income on Pornhub. And so what you see is this really interdependent inter-platform ecosystem. And what this means for the porn makers is that to be a porn star today doesn't look like it did in the studio system of like the early aughts, right? To be a porn star today, you're like a pornfluencer. You are an influencer. You have to have a steady presence. You have to have this really deep parasocial relationship established with your fans. There has to be a level of loyalty where they're willing to follow you from platform to platform in order to create a sense of stability in your income. It means that porn making today is often the actual scenes being shot, the content being shot, has been like paralleled or often even surpassed by the like social media influencer workload of maintaining, what's going on in your DMs, of converting followers on social media platforms to like paying subscribers. That is where the money is in pornography today. So it's turned porn creators into influencers.
It's you made me think back to an article we published in our journal, Film, Fashion and Consumption, many moons ago. I think it was by Neil Kirkham, who obviously you might be familiar from in the British porn studies circles. And it was about, if I'm remembering this all correctly, so forgive me, Neil, if this wasn't you. But basically it was, product placement within, I think the studio was anabolic, and it was product placement used within the scenes. And it's just kind of like, to think about that was a revenue stream. It probably wouldn't be to the same degree these days. So that's kind of an interesting moral panic around American Apparel and other companies utilizing pornography to present their clothing lines as risque or something like that. And I guess it's a bit like, I was joking when I said long form and you mentioned black and white, but at the same time, it is, isn't it? It's like kind of everything else. It becomes like a, how do we click onto the next, and I think it speaks a lot about our our ability to sit there and watch a long form porn movie or a long form movie in general. And I think all of these platforms and the way of commodifying content is obviously, and the way they're monetizing things is probably it's being driven by that too, or is driving that too. I wanted to ask you, like, before we finish up today, I thought we could maybe just talk a little bit about the rise of AI generated content and deep fakes, because I know that that's obviously a hot topic and it's creating a new moral panic, if you will. So is there anything you wanted to say about that, and how might these technologies kind of further complicate, I guess, governance of porn platforms?
Absolutely. So I've also written a little bit on deepfakes. And my writing on deepfakes was really early on. in the deepfake years, like 2018, 19, when we really started to see them emerge. Because quite early on, the early panic about deepfakes was that it was going to be this massive wave of political information. We're entering a post-truth era, right? It's going to be used to manipulate governments around the world. And for years, every headline concerning deepfakes, that tended to be the focus. And meanwhile, the banal, horrific, everyday use of the practice was non-consensual pornography, like through and through. Every analysis, every report that we saw on deepfake creation was just continually affirming that it was being used to harass women and to take away their ability to consent to appear in pornographic content. And so it's often then when attention started to go towards that all of the sympathy and all of the concern was really dedicated to young female celebrities, which obviously victimized by this practice. And I really noticed that nobody was paying attention to the fact that porn performers, because in order to make a deepfake, it's a composite of two different pieces of media where you were taking effectively an image library of facial expressions and mapping them onto pre-existing content. And nobody was worried about what this was doing to the women making this porn in the first place. The fact that they also were having their consent removed, the fact that they also were being spliced into a scene to which they did not consent to have modified or changed. And in the case of the porn performers, there's this double exploitation going on where this is their source of income. This is their livelihood, and their intellectual property is being violated. At the time, I was arguing that it made a stronger legal case for them with this continuous video being modified to maybe use that as a legal route to hold deepfake makers accountable. This is years ago. The practice has obviously morphed a little bit since then. And now, when it comes to deepfakes, I think that one of the more interesting things is that I'm sure you maybe followed what was recently going on with Grok.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
The artificial intelligence that's used on X, and how without any really interference for too long, like 10 days or longer, Grok was turning out millions and millions of instances of non-consensual sexual content. It was disrobing women in their own tweet threads. It was producing, by several accounts that I've heard, amounts of child sexual abuse material, and it was all going unmoderated, right? And because platforms are not held accountable to the content appearing on their sites, this generated a lot of activity and a lot of attention on X. And I didn't see anywhere near the moral panic that I saw levied at the 3,000 instances that year in 2020 that Pornhub had reported as non-consensual content on their sites, right? This was a huge driver. And so once again, I think we see this pearl clutching, this hand wringing around pornography conceptually. But then when actual abuse on large scale takes place on an ordinary social media platform, that's just a glitch in the system. That's not constitutive of the system, right? And of course it is. But more importantly, I do think that in some ways, this is the direction my research is going in next. I've started to be brainstorming what comes after this PhD with a couple of colleagues. And I think that there's been a great deal of mainstream focus on deepfakes, on the potential to use artificial intelligence to abuse or harm or manipulate women when we talk about what can AI do for porn, and also this kind of harmful context of, it's disrupting the adult industry. It's over for these OnlyFans creators. We can make a perfect woman with 3 boobs now. It's over. Why would we ever want a real person? And I think that's so funny because it also is such a fundamental misunderstanding of how the industry works today. I alluded to talked about these porn influencers, how there's this parasocial relationship that is being built up. And you talk to successful creators, and they know this very well, that the reason that people are willing to pay for their pornography isn't because they have achieved the perfect, polished image. It is because they are establishing this relationship with their audiences. They are funny. They are producing content that appeals to their interests. They might have aesthetic sensibilities that they prefer. Of course, there's also the sheer aesthetic of their body type and their hair color and certain preferences. But a huge amount of what makes a creator successful is their ability to do that intimacy work. And artificial intelligence is not going to ever be able to automate out intimacy work to oblivion. But B, it can help, and it is helping creators. And so while your average civilian is saying, oh, it's going to make life harder for the creators, it's going to displace them, behind the scenes, porn creators are incorporating AI into their workflows in a whole lot of really clever ways that are actually extending the logics of platforms. They are helping them scale up their productivity. They're helping them optimize the types of targeted conversations they're having. They're using language learning models to manage their DMs. They're using image generating technologies to help modify and create their content. And we're seeing it being adopted in the adult industry, which is always the case. You know, pornographers, we kind of started this conversation saying they're early adopters of new technologies, they're experimental, they love playing with new techniques. And that is definitely been the case when it comes to automation and AI.
It reminds me of, I think it's Boogie Nights, isn't it? Where it's like the start perhaps, where they're talking about how pornography always pushes the technological envelope. You know, with VHS beating out Betamax or whatever it was to do with pornography and things of that nature. And obviously a big driver for the internet as well. Maggie, this has been awesome. I really, really appreciate your time. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I really appreciate you explaining some of the basics around platformization, monetization, algorithms, and all these things. But also, again, just to really shine a mirror on the hypocrisy around, you know, pornography, the adult film industry, sex work, and the different platforms that facilitate the consumption of these things. So I really appreciate that. And also, because we've talked a lot about moral panics and things like that, I thought as a final question for you, it might be a bit of a big one, but I think you'll be able to handle it in your stride. I was just wondering, why for you is it so important that we study, you know, adult film, adult media, and all these other adjacent topics in a scholarly environment? Because I think we've highlighted a few of those points, but in your words, why is it so important to study porn and to study, you know, sex in general and consumption and platformization of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the reasons that this research appeals to me so much is that from a very, very young age, my personal engagements with pornography, you know, I felt like it was something that gave me knowledge about the world. It brought a sense of expansive horizons. I understood more about what was possible, about things that I was interested in. And the thing about human sexuality is that it's a huge part of our identities. It's a huge part of community formation, of our social lives, of our personal lives. It is something that shapes so many different spheres of the way that we live, right? And I think anyone can tell you that I hope for everyone who's listening that your experiences with sexuality have not been ones that are perpetually riddled with harm and risk and peril and a series of bad outcomes. They are often extremely positive. They're extremely motivating. They're extremely political in many ways. They inspire people to question certain power structures and hierarchies in place. And that's dangerous, right? To the powers that be. Pornography has this long, rich tradition of being like a tool for political change and for political commentary. And I think it's extremely important to study porn from an academic perspective, both to understand how many levels of, you know, technological and political and cultural and economic interplay there are in pornography. And this is because the way that our culture broadly treats sex, and especially sex online, is that it is risky, that it is dangerous, that engaging with it is inherently a problem, that it will put children in harm's way should they ever encounter any information about sexuality. And I think that's a very political framing. I think that, you know, one of the granddaddies of like studying pornography is Walter Kendrick, who writes about this being a long tradition, how institutions would silo away this type of sexual information from people deemed inappropriate, you know, lower classes, women, people of color, and that kind of knowledge and access is only for the purview of the very privileged. And I think that we see that online today. I think there's a reason you can't say porn on TikTok. I think there's a reason that sex is the thing singled out on social media. I think because of that, though, pornography as an industry bears the burden of all sexual expression. Like we are Atlas as an industry with the shoulders of all sexuality of the world above us. And I think that shouldn't be a responsibility that falls to porn. Porn is an industry. It is commodifying sexuality. There is money to be made in it. In a perfect world, they wouldn't have to bear that representational burden. But in practice, pornography does become the cipher through which we get a lot of our sexual information, a lot of our sexual entertainment. And I think it's very important that people understand how deeply technological it is today, how politicized it is, how it's shaping the way that we think, the outcomes of pornography, the supply chain and how it is created. All of these things are very important. And I'm sure also anyone who you speak to who's taught on the subject in the cited collection will tell you, when you go in front of a classroom of students, or you speak to a room full of peers or of lay people in frank ways about issues in pornography, people are thirsty to talk about this in serious and engaged ways. They have so few social outlets in which you can talk about pornography in any context and not be thought of as an absolute freak, the opposite. Well, you want to have a frank discussion about how porn sites work, you can talk until the sun goes down about how Facebook impacts election outcomes. But we don't have many permissible spaces to have these types of conversations be legitimized and be permitted in the public sphere. And I think that academia has this legitimacy foothold. And if we can continually legitimize these as topics that are worth engaging in, that is part of a larger ecosystem of shifting attitudes towards not treating all sex like it's a problem.
Well, on that note, Maggie, I think we'll call it a day. Thank you so much for your time today. That is another beautiful answer. And it's been such a pleasure having you on as a guest. I really think we've been enlightened by having you on here today. If anyone's interested in finding out more, I would recommend giving Maggie a Google. I'd also say that the Intellect Handbook of Adult Film and Media is now available to buy. Also, we are obviously offering desk copies for anyone who's looking to maybe teach the work. And there is a myriad of fantastic chapters and contributions from a wide variety of people on all aspects of adult film and media. So really do go and take a look at that. Go to intellectbooks.com and just have a little, see what you think. And you can obviously buy a copy there or elsewhere if you choose to. Maggie, any final thoughts from you?
I'm very proud to be amongst these writers. I think that there's a lot of incredible contributions here. So I'm in good company, and I hope that reading this tome will answer a lot of people's questions they didn't even know they had.
Thanks to everyone for tuning in. We'll see you next time on In Conversation.